Hi everybody. So I'm starting this for the second time. So I may I don't know. My for some reason my desktop, every time the screen goes on power save mode, it disconnects me from the YouTube recording thing. So I have to keep moving my mouse around and not forget. What I'm going to do today is walk through a few examples of books that include poetry, picture books which include poetry for children. And one thing I want to point out before I start: none of the examples I'm giving you today are really examples of terrible picture books. But I want to look at how poetry, the books in which the poetry is kind of the thing, and the books in which the poetry is sort of supporting something else, because verse is very common in children's literature. The rhythm of it. Dr. Seuss is an example of a very popular writer who includes a lot of verse in his writing, and the quality of the poetry as standalone poetry is not always that great, but that does not in any way diminish what Dr. Seuss is doing or the enjoyment of kids of those books, nor does it really, and that's a very qualified critique of him, because there's a joy of language in his poetry that I think is really powerful for kids. When you read something like Fox and Socks, which I did not bring with me, but you may be familiar with, probably most of you are. Fox and Socks just has a lot of fun with language, and yes, they're made-up words, and that's something I will mention in a bit as sort of a potential critique. It's all there are a lot of made-up words there, and it's relatively easy to rhyme things and make rhythms and stuff when you're making stuff up. But the made-up words are the fun of it, and it gives children a sense that they can actually own language when they see somebody playing with it so comfortably. So I'm going to go through a few examples of poetry for children that I think are really strong examples or interesting examples. And I'm starting with the Gruffalo, and this is the 10th anniversary edition. And we have the hardback, the original hardback as well. That was sent to us by the Dolly Parton Imagination Library, actually. This one we picked up in Toronto, and I cannot remember why we bought it now, because we actually had a really good copy. This is the 10th edition. It was one of Zach's favorites. We enjoyed reading it to him, so I think we saw a 10th edition on the shelf and we grabbed it. It's sort of like when you buy the latest edition of Star Wars with all the director's stuff added in, and then you regret it forever because you can't unsee the replacement of Darth Vader's original ghost with young Anakin. Anyhow, so this is a narrative poem, and it is that means it's a poem that tells a story. And narrative poetry is less and less common in adult verse nowadays. We tend to lean more and more towards, or more often towards, lyric poetry, which are those kind of short, evocative poems that get you thinking about something or feeling something very specific. Narrative poems are poems that tell stories, and really, throughout human history, this has been one of the more common forms of poetry. And the reason is, in pre-literate cultures, including our own, such as the ancient Greeks, what is our own culture? We're a multicultural society. But the things that we tend to teach traditionally as part of the Western canon of literature, I guess, and I guess we kind of live in the West, but anyhow, the things that are part of the Western canon that we study in school in books, like the Aeneid of Virgil, or the Odyssey of Homer, or the Iliad of Homer, these are things that were more than likely originally orally delivered. They were poems that were recited by poets or by performers in front of crowds of people. And one of the reasons for that is that rhythm made it easy to remember the details of the story. So it's kind of a mnemonic device. So this was a way that history and culture were passed on. And it's important to remember that for the Greeks, for example, when they heard the story of the Iliad, what they're hearing is Greek history. So yeah, there are things that are expanded upon and whatnot, but it is a way of passing on history. When the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf has these long stretches that have nothing to do with the main story. They're talking about tribal conflicts and things like that, and again, it's a way of retaining history. So that is part of the heart of narrative, is oftentimes making it easy to remember details through the poetry as a mnemonic device. Of course, that's not the case here. What is remarkable about the Gruffalo is the way in which it has a very strong rhythm. And one of the concerns that I'm going to raise with some of the books I'll talk about later, which are not bad examples of children's literature, but the poetry in them tends to take over the story or take over the book in a way that is potentially distracting, and it's certainly not done as well as it is done in the Gruffalo. Now, one thing I'll say is that the books I'm going to talk about at the end that may not be, they can be great books and the verse can be fun, but they wouldn't be great examples of poetry for children. They're for younger kids, and I will also show you an example of a book for about the same age range that I think does the poetry itself is really interesting. But at any rate, so the Gruffalo uses a very strong rhythm to tell the story. But what's interesting about the Gruffalo is, first of all, it's kind of divided into chunks. So the story is divided into these chapters where this mouse is walking through the woods, he encounters an animal that's going to eat him, and then he claims he's going, or he or she, I don't think it really specifies. Let me go see, I believe it is a he. I should be careful, but at any rate, the mouse. The mouse talks his way out of it by claiming that he's going to meet this terrible monster, the Gruffalo, who likes to eat whatever creature is currently threatening him. So the story is divided into these sort of chapters, and the poem is divided into these verses. In other words, there are segments of the poem that follow a specific rhythmic and rhyming pattern, which then reinforce the chapters, and it varies a little bit. So in terms of within the narrative, the rhythm varies a little bit. It's not always exactly the same sound. Excuse me. But in the same, as the story unfolds going forward, you'll notice the rhythm repeats itself at the equivalent places in the verse. I'll read through two of those to make that point clearer for you. So the book starts, a mouse took a stroll through the deep dark wood. A fox saw the mouse, and the mouse looked good. Where are you going to, little brown mouse? Come and have lunch in my underground house. It's terribly kind of you, fox, but no, I'm going to have lunch with a Gruffalo. A Gruffalo? What's a Gruffalo? A Gruffalo? Why, didn't you know? He has terrible tusks and terrible claws and terrible teeth in his terrible jaws. Where are you meeting him? Here by these rocks, and his favorite food is roasted fox. Roasted fox? I'm off, Fox said. Goodbye, little mouse, and away he sped. Silly old fox, doesn't he know there's no such thing as a Gruffalo? Okay, so you notice there's a variance in rhythm, or in line length, in the way, and you see visually the lines are broken up differently to reinforce what is happening in the story. So I'm trying to move over. It's a big book. Okay, so you see the longer lines with which it begins, the lines diminish as the syllables become shorter, and you see these two shorter lines here, and the description of the Gruffalo is consistently broken up to work with the illustrations to show the features that are being described. And so the next encounter is with the owl. So again, listen to the way in which the chapter, the verse is or this chunk of the story follows rhythmically in the pattern of the first, without the rhythm again completely taking over. So it has that kind of song-like quality, and very much the narrative quality of those epic poems, in that the rhythm will help you remember what's happening in the story, because the rhythm is consistent. Certain parts of the story have a certain feel or flow to them. On went the mouse to the deep dark wood. An owl saw the mouse, and the mouse looked good. Where are you going to, little brown mouse? Come and have tea in my treetop house. It's frightfully nice of you, owl, but no, I'm going to have tea with a Gruffalo. A Gruffalo? What's a Gruffalo? A Gruffalo? Why, didn't you know? He has knobbly knees and turned out toes, and a poisonous wart at the end of his nose. Where are you meeting him? Here by this stream, and his favorite food is owl ice cream. Owl ice cream, to-wit, to-woo. I could never say that in a way that was actually convincing to Zach. I'll point that out right now. Goodbye, little mouse, and away owl flew. Silly old owl, doesn't he know there's no such thing as a Gruffalo? Okay, so so to look at quickly these tips for selecting children and apply them to this. First of all, one of the notes here is the way that narrative poems are really popular for kids, and contemporary poems as well. Poems that kind of are set in a contemporary context. And I just realized I didn't bring an example of that. Some of the examples I'm going to point out where the poetry maybe is not as strong. I have a more contemporary setting, which again, the point I'm making about those is not that they're bad books, so don't misread me or, on my eval say Ray said something nasty about Dr. Seuss, because I did not. So, poetry must be comprehensible to children, and alone or with adult help. This is a poem that is 99.9% of it kids are going to pick up on. And some of the terms like knobbly knees, this is probably the first time Zach heard the term knobbly. But there's an image there. The adult could explain it as well, but there's also an image there. Because the poetry is being interwoven with those images, that will help the child understand that new language. And that's important, that the language need not be dumbed down for kids. Obviously, there's certain types of language or certain words or certain more complex language you might not use in a children's book, but it doesn't hurt to challenge children with new vocabulary. And this book, I think, does that. There are words in here that are, like I said, probably the first time, maybe the first time a child is encountering some of these words. It should evoke emotions. It does. And when you think about evoke emotions, it doesn't mean sad or heart-wrenching or, not every great poem has to be a Hamlet. There's a sense of humor in this poem. There's a sense of drama in this poem. The story kind of builds over time, and then there's that big reveal, and spoiler alert again, the Gruffalo turns out to be real, and there's this, so it has, in a sense, the up and down of a story, and sort of that uber story we've looked at a little bit, that flow of the hero's journey that we looked at in fantasy and folk fiction. That is here. There's a component of that here. The poetry creates concrete images, and again, this is a poem that could stand alone without the illustrations. And it's been illustrated beautifully, and it certainly is not. I don't want to diminish the interaction of the images and the poetry here, because I think it's very effective in how it makes use of them. But the poetry is vivid enough and concrete enough to paint a picture of the story, even without the illustrations. Of course, the rhythm and the sound are very strong here, and this is one of the keys to reinforce the meaning. And that's why I focused on the way the rhythm supports the story, and the pieces of the story being told are consistent across or throughout the book in terms of how the rhythm of that part of the story sounds. And the example, I'm hoping, made that clearer. The best poetry is written in a form suited to content, again, because it's one of those additive tales. The tale kind of evolves throughout, but there's a rhythm to it that there's a repeated action, but there's a variation on the repeated action. That's what I'm so badly and poorly trying to say there. And the verse actually supports that. Does it relate to the experiences of children? Well, even though it's animals, of course, that is the case. You have a small animal surrounded by bigger animals in a world in which he may not be that powerful, and he uses cunning to get his way out of things. And there's that really nice twist where he's been kind of fibbing throughout. Turns out he was actually telling the truth without knowing it, and then he has to talk his way out of getting eaten by the Gruffalo, which is just amazing. So it's got that sort of, it does have a twist, but it is very much about the underdog winning out through cunning. And you see that's a common motif in a lot of children's literature, and in the folk literature from which a lot of our expectations and assumptions about children's literature have kind of evolved out of. Okay, here is, and I've used Margaret Weiss Brown before. She's the author of Goodnight Moon, so a number of you have also used that book. That's come into a number of these presentations. This is Color Kittens. Weiss is also the one who wrote Big Red Barn, and I've told you how much I love that book as well. The Color Kittens, Margaret Weiss Brown, is an example of somebody whose poetry is really interesting. And she uses free verse, which is, poetry that doesn't have a strong rhythm or a strong rhyme in some of her books. There's a book called The Important Book, which there's a rhythm to it, but it's not that sort of fixed, structured, kind of bouncy rhythm with the strong rhyme at the end of every line. It's a very, very nice book if you haven't come across it. And these books get a little bit dated because of the illustrations. To us, I think, and maybe I'm being, but because I was going to say, to me, when I look at these illustrations, they have that very kind of middle of the 20th century style to them. But for a child encountering these for the first time, you don't have, and we sometimes feel as adults we're looking for picture books, we're looking for fresh illustrations, something different, something that stands out. For a child without that historical context, these illustrations are not going to strike them as especially old-fashioned or backwards. Now, this is, in a sense, an example of a prose poem, so you're already getting something a little bit unusual here. But there's strong rhythm, and repetition of images, and I'll read just a little bit to give you a flavor of it. Once there were 2 color kittens with green eyes, Brush and Hush. They liked to mix and make colors by splashing one color into another. They had buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets of colors to splash around with them. Out of these colors they would make all the colors in the world. The buckets had the colors written on them, but of course the kittens couldn't read. They had to tell by the colors. "It's very easy," said Brush. "Red is blue, red is red, blue is blue," said Hush. But they had no green. "No green paint," said Brush and Hush. And they wanted green paint, of course, because nearly every place they liked to go was green. So far it's been largely prose. Here's where the verse kind of kicks in. "Green as cat's eyes, green as grass by streams of water, green as glass." So they tried to make some green paint. Brush mixed red paint and white paint together, and what did that make? It didn't make green, but it made pink. Pink as pigs, pink as toes, pink as a rose or a baby's nose. Now, what is really interesting about this is the fact that she is incorporating the strong rhythm, and she's using rhyme, but it doesn't have that fixed pattern. There's a rhythmic pattern that echoes, the shortness of the lines, the list of those comparisons, pink as this, green as that. But listen to the rhyme scheme of the green. Green as cat's eyes, green as grass. By streams of water, green as glass. So the rhyme is what? The second line and the fourth line. When we get down to our little pink, the verse on pink, pink as pigs, pink as toes, pink as a rose or a baby's nose. You've got the 3 lines there rhyming. So there's anyhow, so her approach is extremely interesting, and there's this, and the images are incredibly powerful, and there's even this sort of weird surrealism to the story. It's very strange. I really like it, and the images of it and the characters in it make it very engaging for kids, and the language is very strong. It's very engaging as well. But I'll read this a little bit from the end, which is really, it's this kind of wild, surrealistic dream that these 2 kittens have. "The kittens fell asleep in a warm, dark night with all their colors out of sight, and as they slept they dreamed their dream. A wonderful dream of a red rose tree that turned all white when you counted 3. And there's the red rose tree, and there goes 1, 2, 3, and there's the white rose. That's awesome. Of a purple land and a pale pink sea where apples fell from a golden tree. And then a world of Easter eggs that danced about on little short legs. And they dreamed that a green cat danced with a little pink dog till they all disappeared in a soft gray fog. And suddenly Brush woke up and Hush woke up. It was morning. They crawled out of bed into a big bright world. The sky was wild." And up here where I thought it had stopped recording again. "The sky was wild with sunshine. The kittens were wild with purring and pouncing." Listen to the rhythm of the language. And another tool that she uses very effectively here is that alliteration, which is that repetition of a consonant sound. So they crawled out of bed, and the sky was wild with sunshine. The kittens were wild with purring and pouncing. The pa and the pa reinforces the rhythm, and it's a very old, it's a very ancient tradition in English. Early English poetry, the Anglo-Saxon poetry, was not so much about rhyming as it was about alliteration, strong rhythm, and then the alliterative verse. So it's an this is an example of a book that it really is. It's a beautifully written poem that has much of what we would see in contemporary modern poetry in terms of exploration of the line, exploration of the rhythms of the verse, variation, not the sort of very fixed verse structure we saw in the Gruffalo, but in the Gruffalo, again, it's handled in a very sophisticated way. I just want to show you one more very quickly, and this is, again, you'll see it's a Dolly Parton's Imagination Library book, and the poem is a traditional poem, and it's a retelling of that. But what's really neat about this is just the way the illustrator has crafted this for younger kids. And I will tell you, this was at one period in Zach's life, one of his favorite books for us to read aloud. And there was always a competition. It's a house that Jack built. And the beautiful thing about it is it begins with Jack carried lumber from the mill to build his house on top of the hill, and then you have Jack. And the illustrations are very simple. They almost have they're contemporary characters, but almost that medieval flatness. If you look at medieval illustration or medieval art, there's a flatness to the characters. It lacks perspective. And in a sense, I mean, this is clearly it's a traditional poem. It's an old poem. And so you're kind of capturing this flavor of that while slightly updating the characters. So this is the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. Now I read that and they're like, yeah, I know that poem, Ray, just go away. But what's neat about it is the illustrator is replacing some of the words with these images. And so as the poem, and if you're not familiar with the poem, it's called a cumulative poem. Every time it goes around, it adds to it. So this is the cat that killed the rat that ate the... Well, I skipped a line, but you know, there was a rat mentioned and a cat mentioned, so you know, I'm introducing... I skipped ahead, so I didn't want to ruin the story for you. This is the cat that killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. And so each line adds until you get to the end, and you see those images are put in there. And what's nice about this is it encourages the child to engage in the poem. In other words, they're creating some of the language of the poem as they're going along. And we had a game when my son was little. Every time we said the house that Jack built, when my wife would hear us doing this book, she would hide around the corner and try to beat Zach to saying that Jack built, because it goes faster and faster and faster and faster as you read, or at least as I read it. I would torment him by going faster and faster and faster, and he'd try to keep up with me. It's a tremendously fun book to read. But it's a neat example of how the illustrator can do something very creative to engage the child in the poetry. So the child becomes part of the creation of that poetry by turning those images into words that fit the rhythm of the line. So just a few quick examples, and I think I'll go down. I'll trim this down to just a single example of a book that you probably. There's a good chance you own this book if you've got kids. And I don't want to say it's a terrible book, though, to be honest. I never liked it that much, but Zach liked it. Put Me in the Zoo by Robert Lopshire, and Lopshire is sort of in some ways, and he's very similar to Dr. Seuss in his storytelling, in his poetry, in the illustrations to some extent, and he in some ways, I want to say this carefully, it's not that the poetry is terrible poetry, but when I read it to you, you'll see it feels sometimes like the poetry has taken over the story, and it's partially a rhythm thing, and it's partially the sense that sometimes the line is straining to find the rhyme, and this is so common, and I think in a lot of songwriting especially. Excuse me, you know, as much as I like Bob Dylan or Led Zeppelin, the Doors, Jim Morrison, who is considered a great poet. He's an iffy poet, but don't tell anybody I said that. I guess I shouldn't put it on YouTube if I didn't want you to tell anybody I said that. But there are these lines in songs written by these guys who are, I don't want to diminish them as musicians at all. I love them both. Bob Dylan is one of my favorite artists, but there are lines in their songs that are clearly designed to rhyme. I mean, there's a line I'm going to think of it by the end of this video. It's Tangled Up in Blue. There's a line in Tangled Up in Blue where he is trying to rhyme. The guy encounters this woman he'd known in his past in a bar, and he's trying to rhyme. The woman asks him, "Don't I know your name, Jimmy? Don't I know your name?" And he's trying to rhyme that with he's trying to rhyme that. So there's the line that bothers me all the time is, "The crowd thinned out, and I was about to do the same," and then their same rhymes with. But the problem is, he was not about to thin out, and that's just the meaning of the line is meaningless. The crowd thinned out and I was about to do the same. He wasn't, what was he, going on a diet or something like that? No, he meant he was about to leave, but that's not what it actually says. But the rhyme, the need for that rhyme constrained him, and that's a long aside. I will go to the zoo. Let me just read a bit of this, and then we'll wrap this up, because I see I'm at 25 minutes already. But you've not been treated to a Ray picture book video for a while, so I just want to make sure you have time to enjoy it. This is the last one, because we'll be getting into your presentations at the end, so I just want to make sure you enjoy it. I will go to the zoo. I want to see it. Yes, I do. I would like to live this way. This is where I want to stay. See, my voice is even. I can't keep out of the rhythm of the line. Will you keep me in the zoo? I want to stay in here with you. We do not want you in the zoo. Out you go. Out, out with you. And they're rhyming the same words. And now there's a power to that rhythm that kids will enjoy. But is this great poetry? Well, is the language concrete? No, it isn't really. The language by itself, for one thing, it's very simple words, and it is for slightly younger children. But when you read something like Fox and Socks, Seuss's stuff, you'll see how the language can still be concrete, whatever, even if it's for children. So, but also the rhythm, that bouncy rhythm, it's not uncommon, and it is the kind of thing that kids will enjoy. But when the rhythm takes over from the story, when the rhythm is so overpowering, what it actually does is it distracts us from the story. And it can cause us to, read in a way that undermines the sentence itself. In other words, the meaning of the line that is a unit of meaning is a sentence. But if I'm pausing at the end of every line to hit the rhythm, to hit the rhyme, then I'm breaking up those sentences, which can make it harder for the child to understand what's being read. So you have to be very careful when you read a book like this, not to let the rhythm completely take over. And I'm not saying it becomes incomprehensible or anything like that, but the units of meaning, the poem does not necessarily reinforce the meaning. The rhythm does not necessarily reinforce the units of meaning in the verse. So I would like to live this way. This is where I want to stay. Will you keep me in the zoo? I want to stay in here with you. So anyhow. So that's an example not of a terrible children's book, but of a book where potentially the line is taking over. And then there was one thing I wanted to and I don't want to. This is Dr. Seuss writing as Theo Lezig. I don't know. But anyhow, it illustrated by somebody. This is one of the books. There are a number of Dr. Seuss books that he wrote, which weren't really part of the Dr. Seuss franchise. Let's say, in other words, they didn't have that. There's a certain consistency about Dr. Seuss books from one to the next, and there are other books that he wrote and published that don't necessarily fit in with the rest of his canon, and many of these he didn't illustrate either. They were illustrated by others, and some of them have come out more recently. This Dr. Seuss books for beginning readers have brought a lot of these, and they're not bad books. They're fun books. But here's an example of the sorts of things Dr. Seuss does, which are fun, but they're kind of cheating sometimes. This is a book about teeth. There's a snail. This little boy's going around encountering things that have teeth. And it's a little bit Bob Dylan-esque sometimes, in that you do feel the strain for the rhyme from time to time. I wish I were a mime. See, that's the sort of thing that happens. You want to make the rhyme, and it changes the meaning of what you're saying completely. I don't actually wish I were a mime. You're lucky that you have your teeth, says a sad, sad snail named Simon Sneath. Simon Sneath. Why Simon Sneath? Well, maybe, and I don't want to assume this, but maybe because Sneath rhymes readily with teeth. So that's an idea. So as you do this, first of all, you're not going to be talking for half an hour, because you're going to be looking at 2 books. I just want you to apply those tips for selecting poetry for children, just to compare a very strong example of a book that uses poetry really well, or the poetry in the book itself is good. When you apply these tips, it really feels like that poetry is really quality poetry. And then another book that may use it less effectively, or a book in which the poetry, it's not really about the poetry. And so this is an example, the one I chose here, or the Tooth book. These are not bad books, and nor is the poetry in them completely bad either. Even the story I read about the guy with the spots who wants to live in the zoo, you know, it's not a terrible book, and the poetry is not terrible. But when you contrast it to Margaret Weiss Brown, when you contrast it to the Gruffalo, you see the difference when you have very well written, effective poetry, and possibly, you know, a poetry that's written for children's enjoyment, and kids will enjoy it, but it just doesn't rise to the same level. If I talk for 20 more seconds, this will be exactly half an hour. So let me just say I've really enjoyed your picture book reports throughout this semester. We're down to 13 seconds now, and I look forward to your final outside reading. There we go. Reports.